Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Here's a little concept that I wanted to talk about, which I think is good to think about with writers for a couple of really specific things I'll get into later. But that is the idea that history is analog, because time is analog. Time is always moving towards us and past us. And the nature of our societies, our cultures, these change very slowly over time. There are still really big historical events that happen that can change everything. Like, one nation can lose a battle, and that's going to immediately and quickly change the direction that that society may go in. But when we're thinking about like the stylistic changes of arts, if you're studying the arts, you find that styles change very slowly and in an analog fashion. It's not like you get to the year 1600 and everybody stops writing, Palestrina style polyphony and people start writing, Baroque counterpoint, right? That doesn't happen that way. Things develop slowly over time. People slowly adopt new ideas and stop using old ideas in the arts. Styles get passed from one artist to another, get iterated on until you have something that we identify as a coherent style in an artistic period. But that's not really how they work or how they happen. You'll find if you're studying medieval music, that medieval music, especially late medieval music, like Guillaume de Machat or something, like it transitions kind of smoothly into a lot of Renaissance styles, and those transition into Baroque styles, and the Baroque style really transitions into the classical style. By the time you get to like Handel and Bach, you're pretty close to the Galant, and then the Galant transitions into the classical, and the classical transitions into the romantic. It's like, who's Beethoven? Is he classical or romantic? He's classical and romantic. He's kind of both, because the stylistic change is very analog. It's when you take a snapshot, you're like, what was the music like in 1820? All right, here's all the music in 1820, and you have this idea. That's the romantic style. All this stuff is the romantic style. There might be people who are still playing Bach. There might be people who are still playing Handel at places, right? There might be people who are still playing Mozart, and Mozart might still be very popular, and people are still studying Mozart even though Mozart's been dead, right? So taking those little snapshots are really helpful to think of like what are the main features of a style or of a period. But of course, people are still experiencing the art of the past. Same thing with visual arts, right? If you're looking at a great romantic painter, you're looking at Caspar David Friedrich, one of my favorites. It's great. Okay, this is the romantic style. Well, he was probably still going to churches where there was like Baroque and Renaissance art in them, right? So he was still experiencing art from past ages. People were still experiencing art from past ages. Yeah, they might be hearing newer music, but they might also be hearing older music. And then as time goes on, that those features continue to happen, over and over again. As we hear some old stuff, we hear new stuff kind of at the same time. Styles transition slowly from one to the other. And this is also true for the way that people live, the way cultures exist, like what styles are popular in clothes. Even when we get up to the corporate period, if we get up to the 20th century and styles may rapidly evolve and rapidly change, they're not overnight. You find that even something like, if we're thinking of music like Nirvana, Nirvana is kind of this bomb of like, this is the 1990s, this is the early 1990s, this is Nirvana. Well, you had bands like REM that predated Nirvana, the Belvins, right? Stylistically, there was a lot of stuff that predated Nirvana, and Nirvana always considered themselves a punk band, so you still have, the punk influence that's coming before that. You find that there are many things that sound kind of like Nirvana happening before Nirvana sells a lot of records. So it wasn't like styles emerged overnight. These things happened slowly, and then they slowly transitioned away, like the alternative sound slowly transitioned away from the kind of punk oriented Nirvana stuff towards a more kind of straightforward rock sound by the end of the 90s, and people still called it alternative. Lots of stylistic changes are like that, whether it's in metal or rock or jazz, right? We tend to think of like, cool jazz happened at this point in time. Miles Davis recorded A Kind of Blue, and that was cool jazz. Well, he also recorded Birth of the Cool, right? Which, so the style goes further back and crosses further over. It's analog. And it's the same thing with the periods that people live in and the lives that they experienced and the cultures that they experienced in the past. It wasn't like Rome fell and then the medieval period began. Well, we still had, the Byzantine Empire, still had Eastern Rome that continued all the way. Where did antiquity end? Well, it didn't just end overnight. Like the fall of Rome is a big event, and that big event is important, and it changed a lot of things, and it changed the direction of a lot of things. But people did not like wake up the next night and be like, I have forgotten to read how to read, right? Thus the Dark Age begins, or something like that. These things happen kind of slowly over time. Eventually, Rome went from the biggest city in the world to having like 30,000 people or less in it or something. It became a much smaller town. It depopulated, but it took centuries for that to happen. It wasn't like Rome fell and everyone just left the city. It's like over time, the entire empire ruralized, which was an interesting phenomenon, right? Like when did the medieval begin? Well, I mean, it's hard to say. It slowly grew out of late antiquity, and late antiquity grew out of regular antiquity. By the time you get to someone like Constantine the Great, some people have said, Constantine the Great was in a lot of ways the last classical emperor and the first medieval emperor. He was Domus, he was Lord, whereas before that, the emperor at least wore the title of Optimus Princeps, like first citizen, whereas Constantine was more thoroughly and openly an autocratic lord, an autocratic king, a monarch, not just the first citizen, but a real bona fide monarch. So those sorts of things grew slowly over time, right? It wasn't like Constantine woke up and be like, I'm going to redo what the emperorship is. No, that developed over time as well. It's like over time we slowly went from Augustus to Constantine. Over time, it became more and more obvious that it was a military position, and it was about what the emperor did as a military leader, not just like a first citizen or something like that. So those positions evolved slowly over time. Likewise, it wasn't like there was just a bunch of nothing that happened between the fall of Rome and Charlemagne. There was a bunch of things that happened, a bunch of things that developed. There was new technology that was developed, new writing systems. The Carolingian Renaissance is a very cool period to study because there was a lot of new kinds of newfangled writing techniques that were pioneered during that time and carried forward into the medieval period. But the point is that the scribes who invented the writing weren't reinventing writing, right? They knew how to read and write Latin and things at that time. They just kind of took it to the next level. And, the high Middle Ages grows out of the early Middle Ages, kind of slowly. Late medieval transitions into the Renaissance, rather slowly. It wasn't like Columbus set sail in Columbus set sail in 1492 in what was like effectively a late medieval arrangement of things, right? Ferdinand and Isabella had just expelled the Muslims from Spain. That was a big deal. And you think of that as a crusade. The Reconquista was a kind of crusade. Like, that's a medieval thing. It's like, well, these things don't just, it wasn't like, oh, this happened and then thus the Renaissance began. Columbus found some new land. Let us begin the Renaissance. Renaissance ideas were present before that. They persisted after that event. Things changed gradually over time. And then eventually the Renaissance gave way to more evolved artistic standards in the Baroque, right? So all these things happen slowly over time. The political nature of Italy happens slowly over time. It's like you take a cool snapshot of like late Middle Ages Italy, and you see all these city-states and Renaissance Italy with its little internal wars and sometimes wars with France and things like that, and the Borgias, right? You have Pope Alexander VI, very infamous pope who had children and put his children as leaders in other Italian city-states. Very interesting stuff to read about. That didn't happen overnight, though, right? There was all these things that slowly led to that and then kind of slowly led out of that situation over time. So that's my big point. Now, what do writers need to take away from this before I kill this video? Well, one of the things you have to remember is that there's no such thing as Baroque dress. Baroque dress may have been different in 1650 from 1750. In fact, it was probably wildly different, right? Because you had like a Rococo style that evolved, and then you're going to have dress that kind of went along that style. So when you're taking a snapshot of where people are at and how they're dressing, you'll find that it's not very unified. We group these things into periods for convenient analysis and thought about like kind of prevailing ideas, prevailing styles, typical presentations of like what the Baroque painting style was, what the Baroque counterpoint style was, that kind of stuff. It's shorthand. It's a convenient way to think of it, but it's not going to be accurate in any given year. So as you set something in a given year, you have to remember that these things are going to be a little bit different when you look at one year. There may be things that are missing, right? Things that haven't developed yet, and you may have a lot of stuff that hangs over from previous periods, I guess. So keep that in mind when you're writing like historical fiction, or if you're making, say, a fantasy universe and you're thinking like, I'm going to be inspired by the High Middle Ages. Well, you'll find that there's very different styles of armor, for instance, in the High Middle Ages. Maybe very attracted to the knight in shining armor, the plate armor with a big cuirass and a big bassinet helm or something else. And that may be very alluring, and you see it in Disney movies. You see all these knights going around with the lances. It's like those knights existed with musketeers, right? There were guns. That's where bulletproof came from, is they would shoot it at the cuirass, and if the musket ball couldn't penetrate the armor, then it was good to go. Conquistadors wore plate mail, right? They wore plate armor, but had guns and stuff, right? So it's like, my point is like late Middle Ages stuff. It's like, it's really attractive to look at those cool armor things and think, oh, it's gonna be knights fighting with swords. And it's like, not really, so like a lot of guns, pikemen, and knights were not maybe a huge thing by the end of the 15th century, but that's where the armor comes from. Most of those cool armor sets are from like the 15th, 16th century, when knights were not the force on the battlefield. They were in like the 12th century, when knights wore mail and maybe like one of those big great helms or something like that. They wore different armor. So it's interesting to think about. So when you're inspired by that, think about how all those things go together. Why did they wear plate mail? And why did this develop? And what was it in response to? And what's the technological look like for a narrow range in the historical in your historical catalog for that kind of stuff, and just go with it from there. So anyway, that's what I want to say about that. History is analog. It's a different way of thinking about history, I think, than what we're taught. We're taught to think of the big events, the fall of Rome and Augustus and Caesar being assassinated. And yes, these are big, important events, and civil wars are big, and wars are big, and battles are big, and all that stuff's important, right? But when it comes to the attitudes of people, the way they live their lives, that's kind of a slow transitionary thing where things happen over years. There's disruptive events, but even when there's a disruptive event, it may take years or decades or a century for lifestyles to fully change from that. It took probably 100 years for European society to fully react to the Black Death and change its arrangements away from serfdom. There was a labor shortage. This is interesting to think about with the Black Death. There was a labor shortage, so that the kings and nobles passed laws that said people couldn't charge more than a certain amount of money for their labor, because it was like, wait a minute, all the peasants are dead, and the peasants that are still alive want more money because there's so few of them. Now, in normal economic situation, wages would rise. They're like, wait a minute, wages are getting too high. We can't just be paying our money to peasants. No more money for you, peasants, right? So it took a long time for like serfdom to really just kind of evaporate from the European landscape. And it didn't evaporate everywhere. You still had the equivalent of serfdom in certain parts of Europe. Like Eastern Europe kept some of those social distinctions, and Western Europe seemed to evolve out of them. It's really interesting to look at how those things slowly change over time, not just the disruptive events that make a big impact. And I think it's more true with the arts, I think, than with, for instance, politics, where, if a country gets conquered, that's a big deal, but their art may not change, right? Their art may stick around and continue being their art for quite a long time or forever afterwards. So interesting to think about. Let me know what you think down below in the comments section about time being analog versus having like big disruptive events that really define define what a period is or what a period does. So let me know, and I will look forward to reading them. Have a great one. Oh, also, you can join my Patreon, patreon.com/DavidVStewart, /DavidVStewart. It's linked down below. You can join the Discord, get a free book every month. Same thing with Ko-Fi. So have a good one, and I'll check you all on the flip side.